And now I have the pleasure of introducing Ann Fessler.
Whoops! What happened? Sorry.
That's okay. Okay.
Yeah. It said get on the guest list.
Okay, I can see you. Ann Fessler, author, filmmaker, visual artist, and educator. Her book, The Girls Who Went Away, places women's stories within the social history of the time and her own story, and combines her own story as an adoptee. It was called a remarkably well-researched and accomplished book by the New York Times, and a blend of deeply moving personal tales bolstered by solid sociological analysis, journalism of the first order by the San Francisco Chronicle. The Girls Who Went Away was chosen as one of the top 5 nonfiction books of 2016 by the National Book Critics Circle, and was awarded the Ballard Book Prize, given annually to a female author who advances dialogue about women's rights. Ann's documentary film, A Girl Like Her, released in 2012, combines the voices of the mothers she interviewed with the footage from the era, including educational films about dating, sex, and illegitimate pregnancy, and newsreels about adoption that both reflected and shaped the public's understanding of unwed pregnancy and surrender. Ann, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I've had previous dealings with Adoption Network Cleveland. They sponsored a film screening, a great big event back in 2012 that was just wonderful. It's a great organization. So I'm very happy to be involved in this. I think it sounds like most of you have read the book, but just to, for maybe somebody who hasn't, I think there's at least one adoptee who hasn't. I will just say very briefly that it is an era that I think is extremely hard for anybody to imagine if they didn't grow up during that time and were not of, you know, teen years or college years during the 50s or 60s. It was so different than today that I just think it's hard for anyone younger, and especially they would be the children, the surrendered children of the moms that I interviewed. Very, very hard for them to imagine a world like the world that the women I interviewed and I grew up in, and probably many of you here. It was a world of shame and blame. It was the good girl, bad girl dichotomy, which paralleled good mother, bad mother. If you were pregnant outside of marriage, then you were a bad girl and therefore could not be a good mother. You were generally sent away. If you were a middle-class girl, who were the bulk of the women who surrendered at that time, then you were encouraged or on your own went away to hide, because you would your reputation would be ruined. You would be an outcast. Friends that you had would no longer hang around with you. Parents of friends of yours would not let you hang around with a bad girl like that who went and got herself pregnant. It was the woman's fault. It was expected that the man was going to at least try to make some headway on the sexual front, but it was the woman's job to put the brakes on. And if she didn't, it was her fault. Out of the 100 women I interviewed, I will say 7 became pregnant from non-consensual sex. So when we're talking about women who surrendered, it's not all women who were involved in, you know, relationships with boyfriends. There were also rapes and other kinds of situations. But many of the women, I would say the vast majority of the women that I interviewed, which was 100 women from every region of the country, in person. I only interviewed people in person. I don't do, well, at the time there wasn't Zoom, but I don't do phone interviews. I do everything in person. I think the vast majority became pregnant with their first, if not second, sexual partner, mostly their first. And they were pretty naive about how easy it was to get pregnant. People used to have this phrase they used at that time about married couples trying to get pregnant. And I think we all thought that it must be hard to get pregnant, because you always heard about married couples trying, you know, and it was okay for them to try. It was not okay for anyone else to try. And anyway, it was a time when it was not just the girl who was shamed if she became pregnant. She was, her family, it was a reflection on the family, because at that time in the post-World War II environment, there was a lot of conformity. You had many, many families moving up into solid middle class status. There was a great rise in the middle class, and formerly working class, formerly agricultural families, basic middle class families were all gaining a lot in the post-World War II era, economically, in terms of jobs. Women were starting to go to college. There were many opportunities, many, many changes at that time. And one way that a family could be sort of immediately expelled from that nice middle class status was to have a pregnant daughter. And it was a reflection mainly on the mother, because the father was, the breadwinner. That was his job. And the mother's job was to raise fine, upstanding children. And if she failed in that by having a pregnant daughter or a boy who was sent to juvie hall for getting in some kind of trouble, that was a real reflection on her parenting abilities, her child rearing abilities. And for so many of the women of that time who stayed home once they had children, it was definitely a reflection on the mother, and is part of the dynamic that led to so many families really wanting their daughters to be sent away and to hide, so that no one else in the community would know that their daughter was pregnant, because it would reflect on the family. I interviewed people that where the family literally moved to another town because they were afraid that people would find out. And it was just, they figured it was a good time to move, so the daughter could go off and to a maternity home, have her child, surrender the child. And then when she came back, they would show up in a new town. She'd be at a new school. There'd be no talk, no rumors about where she'd been. I mean, pretty drastic measures were taken to hide this. And for the young woman, initially, it might have been, a crisis. This is a very, very big deal to have to tell your parents that you've become pregnant, and all the things that ensue after that. And to, if you're in school, you are immediately expelled from school. It wasn't until the Title IX amendment in 72, Title IX amendment to the Educational Act, that women were not booted out of school if they became pregnant. High school or college, because if the school was getting any kind of state funding, then they could no longer do that. The young man was allowed to continue his education because he could deny responsibility. He could say, well, she was also sleeping with somebody else, because you didn't have accurate paternity testing at that time. So you could not narrow it down to one person like you can do today with DNA. So the woman was, not all, of course, not all the men took that position. Some of them wanted to get married. Some of them, joined the army, ran away. They were so upset with the way their parents dealt with the situation. But they could, if they wanted to, deny involvement. And it was really, everything was on the shoulders of the woman and her family. There were also, people think that everybody in the book is young, but I interviewed people who were teachers and nurses at the time. And you could not be a teacher in a public school, certainly not a Catholic school. No school really would allow a never married woman with a baby to be a teacher, because she was supposed to be an example to her kids, her students, and a never married mother was a bad example. And so she would lose her job immediately, whether, you know, if there was any proof in the community, whether she kept the child or not, but certainly if she kept the child, that was the end of her teaching career. And it was the same for a lot of nurses. The interesting thing is that so many of the women were told when they were at the maternity home that they were not capable of raising a child. Imagine if you're a nurse and you're caring for other people and you're being told that you're not worthy to be a mother or capable of being a mother when your whole life is taking care of other people. My point is that I think it's very difficult to imagine a social structure such as this. Also compound this situation with the fact that women were not in charge of their own birth control, in the sense that condoms were the only thing available until the very late 60s, early 70s, and in some states until 1973, it was illegal for a single person to obtain birth control. Unless it was prescribed by a doctor, meaning you had to go to a doctor and get it examined. This would be men or women. And that was changed in 73. And some states up until the mid 60s, it was illegal to prescribe birth control to married people. So imagine, this is a really different environment. So women could not take a pill, you know, if you went to a doctor as a single woman and said you wanted an IUD, if you could get one, or some other method of birth control, you might just be told by the doctor, you know, I'm not giving you that, you're not married. People used to put wedding rings on and go, and, you know, even when birth control was first available, and try to get birth control, and doctors would turn them down and say that, you know, you wait until you're married to take that. So even though 68% of people under 20 were having sex by the mid 60s, the environment, the social environment was that, you know, parents turned a blind eye to it. You know, so you have to, you know, blaming the individual you know, allows the larger social system to decline any responsibility for a situation like this. So, you know, I believe in personal responsibility, but when you have this number of young people having sex and you're denying them birth control and you're denying that they're even having sex, you're going to have a massive amount of pregnancy. And that's what happened. The women were shamed, were sent out of town. What's worse, they were told to lie about it for the rest of their lives by a lot of the professionals involved, whether everybody they consulted, clergy, people at the homes, family, told them that they should never tell anybody because they, you know, no good man would ever want them if they knew this about them. They were not, a lot of them were totally unprepared for giving birth, despite the fact that the maternity homes had a kind of captive audience. Many of them told the girls nothing about what to expect from about giving birth. In some cases they did, but in many cases they didn't. They were totally shocked. And of course they were, they were unprepared, having never given birth before, for the emotions they would feel once they gave birth. So, you know, you have a young woman who's scared and afraid and everything is falling down around them and they're being shamed and blamed. And then the child is born, and very often that's a total turnaround in terms of how they're feeling about the entire situation. And by that time, if they did have any hopes of trying to keep their baby. It was by that time, you know, the conveyor belt had moved down been moved down the conveyor belt so far that it was nearly impossible to reverse things. There were a few families who came to the rescue, but for the most part, once you really understood that this is your child, which I think people can't really understand until that baby is born and you're looking at that baby and holding that baby. It's no longer just a problem. It's, you know, now you're a mother. For some women were not allowed to see their babies. Some women got to hold their babies once. A couple women I know were able to actually stay at the home for a while, and there were homes where the children were kept there in the nurseries. And at least one woman that I interviewed actually took care of her baby for a couple weeks in the nursery at the maternity home. And then one day she came and he was gone. For the most part, no counseling, no support, go home, forget this ever happened, you'll have other children, get over it, don't tell anybody. It's like all the worst kind of advice for somebody who's just gone through a huge loss and trauma. You know, unless your family was willing to help, given women's wages at the time, given the lack of childcare, given the whole social, you know, strata, stigma, everything, unless your family came to your rescue and said, we'll help, we'll watch the child while you're, you know, working or whatever, you didn't really have a hope or a prayer. You know, some women were able to kind of stuff it down and try to say, well, it was all for the best and forget. But many women had PTSD, suffered, you know, migraines, had relationship issues, trust issues, just a whole host of things that can come about through such a huge loss with no counseling, no way to grieve, and then later coming around maybe to guilt, like, you know, first it's, you know, how could you get pregnant? Then later maybe, you know, how could I have surrendered my child? You know, as society starts to change and the context in which someone is living starts to change, then, you know, some women are beating themselves up about, you know, they could have done it. Why didn't they try harder to make it happen? So all in all, it's a pretty depressing, sad history. But what's really incredible is that so many people don't know about it, and so many adoptees don't know about it and feel that they were just tossed aside and you know, that their mother wanted to go on and have a lot of fun and didn't want the, you know, hassle of dealing with the baby and you know, good riddance kind of. And I never, in all my stories that I recorded, all the women I met who I didn't know ahead of time, I didn't know their story ahead of time, I just walked in cold, I didn't hear that story ever. It was a life-altering event that affected every decision really from that point on in their life, in terms of the way it impacted them and changed their perspective. And so when I first met a woman who was a first mom and heard her story, the first story I ever heard directly from the mouth of a mom, I was just as surprised. I thought I understood adoption. I come from a family that's all put together by adoption. I'm an adoptee. My brother is an adoptee. My adoptive mom is an adoptee. And so I thought I had this really great, you know, picture of adoption, thought I understood it well. But I realized after meeting this woman that everything I knew came from the mouth of people about the moms, came from the mouth of the people who were not moms. And that I'd never actually heard the story of adoption from the mouth, one-to-one, from the mouth of a mother who had to surrender her child. And when I heard the first story, it was like a huge, light bulb lighting up, because all my work up to that point in a variety of forms had been about women's issues and the gap between history as it's written by authority figures and history as that same history as it is experienced by those who live it. And, history theoretically is all of our stories, but we don't all get to write those stories. So, academics write them, and people with some sort of authority write them, but very often they're writing about through their own filters about the lives of other people, and those people don't have their own voice or don't get to tell their own stories. And so since that was my goal in other work that I'd done, when I heard this story, I just knew that this was something I needed to take on. And my goal was to record as many stories as I could. I didn't even have a book in mind when I started recording. I wanted to record stories. I thought I would use them in these audio installations I was doing and in a film. And I was doing footage research because I'd found some pretty remarkable footage that was sending out messages about what adoption was and all these unwanted babies that were out there for adoption and so forth. And so I knew that I wanted to put all that together, but the more I looked into it and the more I researched and found about the context, and context is everything. So the more I found out about the context of that time, I lived through it, but it's different when you're researching it than living through it. That led to, many more interviews and doing the book. And I still feel today that the important thing about the project is going to be the archive of those stories, so that that are being donated to a collection of women's history in America. And those stories, I'm interested in those stories being available 200 years from now, 300 years ago. What I do with them is one thing, my own creative work, but what my concern was that the women were aging and that these stories might disappear. And as a matter of fact, this last year, 3 of the women I interviewed passed away. And I don't know how many more, because I stayed in touch with some women quite frequently, and other women I lost touch with over time. So I don't know how many are gone, but 3 women I was pretty close to within the last year and a half passed away. So that's one of the things that I'm happiest about and most proud about, is that now that their stories weren't lost. So the other project that we've mentioned here and there is the film, and the film functions in a slightly different way than the book. And maybe this would be a good time to play the trailer, if we can, to the film, the preview trailer of the film. And then I can just mention briefly how that functions in a slightly different way than the book. And then I would like to open it up for questions.
Julius, we don't have volume. Give us a second, we'll get that running with volume.
I was 15 that summer, but I don't even remember what we did. Probably drove around in his car. He had a baby blue 57 Chevy. Riding in that car, and I felt really important. Wow, this is what dating is like.
I mean, things were a lot different then. And no one talked about sex. There was no sex education in school.
I could tell that he knew a little bit more, and as ridiculous as it sounds, I was learning from him.
I started gaining weight, and I missed my second period, and I still tried to deny it.
My mom treated it like it was her personal tragedy.
My parents' generation, that greatest generation, that's what they thought. It didn't happen to nice girls, but nice girls do get pregnant.
They called the doctor. The doctor said, well, you send her away to a home for unwed mothers, and she gives the child up and it'll all blow over.
My mother came and got me and let me stay at home for a few weeks. I was 3 months pregnant, and she said, you don't look it now, but you will soon, and so I want you out of this house. And she said, if you keep your baby, never come back.
You're going to be taken care of, but you're going to have that baby, and you are going to do the only thing that is right, and that is you're going to give this baby to good people, decent people, because you are so bad and so flawed for just having this happen. There's no way you could possibly provide what a child would need.
I just felt like I had done this horrific thing, and I was not in any position to protest or say, you know, what I wanted. Certainly, I wasn't in any position to say, well, is there any way that my baby wouldn't have to be taken? I mean,
People say to me, oh, it's not that way anymore. I said, it's still that way for a lot of us. A lot of my sisters are still suffering.
I don't think people realize how many women lost their babies.
this young woman that they locked away was not allowed to have her voice.
One of the great things about the film is that it works when people read, they read alone, right? It's a one-on-one experience with the book. But with the film, I can screen it for an audience and then have a conversation. Now, keep in mind, this is all before Zoom. I realize now we can do this and we can have a conversation, but I'm talking about I screen it in an audience with 200 college students, and then we start talking immediately afterwards in a Q&A or at a conference or, whatever. And I don't really feel like the film is even complete unless I get to have that opportunity to answer questions. Because when I show it in a college with young people in their 20s, for example, who see this now, they cannot believe that this happened. Certainly not in my lifetime or their mother's lifetime or their grandmother's lifetime. And so it's an opportunity to answer their questions and kind of complete that circle. It's also been, I know a lot of moms have used it to get other people in their family to understand what they went through, because it's harder to get somebody to read a 350-page book. And so sometimes they just watch this film. It's 48 minutes, and so it kind of brings people up to speed a little more quickly. But the other thing is that the film it went around the film festival circuit, which means that it was shown to a lot of people who have no connection to adoption. And so that was really, I'm all about educating people. And so the idea that I could reach outside of this community and it's the same when I present it maybe in a college, but it's a little different when you have a group of people who are looking at it as a film, and they have different kinds of questions about how things were put together and editing and all that sort of thing. But the message is still coming through. The content is still reaching them. And so it's a great way, a kind of community engagement, a great way to get the information to people who might not otherwise even come across it, or would not think to, read a book that has to do with adoption, because they don't think it has anything to do with their life and they're busy. Although now with DNA, a lot of people are learning adoption does have something to do with their life that they didn't know before. But Anyway, it's functioned that way. And also the other thing is when I presented it, whenever I could, when I presented it either at conferences or at film festivals, and this was both in the US and abroad, I would try to have first moms there with me afterwards in the Q&A to answer questions, because I feel like I'm a conduit. Like I'm putting all this in a package, but they're their stories. They're not my story. I'm the facilitator and the conduit to get their stories to the public. And so I shouldn't be the one up there on the stage answering all the questions. I want them to be sharing the stage with me. And so we had some really amazing screenings where it was being presented again to a film audience, and the people in the audience were actually shocked that, you know, two women would stand up there with me and say, I'm a birth mother and this happened to me. And actually for the women, it was very empowering. And so that's another thing that's been really rewarding for me, is that a lot of the women who initially were reluctant, they used aliases in the book. They didn't use their actual first name. They were, you know, sort of kept in the shadows if there was like an event where maybe I was showing the film, and gradually a bunch of these moms really came out. And in the making of the film, when I got to the end and I have a whole list of people who were involved, by the time that happened, they're like, use my first name, my maiden name, my married last name. I want it up there on the screen. I'm not ashamed anymore. And and so it was to watch the progress between the time that I interviewed people for the book. I started 19 years ago interviewing women for the book. I started in 2002. And so it took, 4 years or something to finish the book and have it come out in 2006. So the film came out in 2012. So during that time period, the women that were involved, some of the women that were involved would come to bookstore talks, because when you do a book, then you go and do talks at bookstores and so on and so forth. So a lot of moms sort of came forward and took part in that. But by the time the film was done, they were much more out, and I was very proud of them, because I know it was hard for a lot of them. A lot of their families didn't know. When I interviewed them, some of their husbands didn't know that they had a child, and a lot of them hadn't told their children. And part of that was because they had not had a reunion yet, and they didn't want to tell their children and then say, but I don't know where they are. At least that was the excuse. But they felt like if they had a reunion, they found their child, then they would break it to their subsequent children and say, I found him or her, and they want to meet you, and that sort of thing. So there was quite an evolution of events that happened during the process, from starting the interviews for the book and finishing the film. And then I had my own evolution, in that I did, the book ends with me meeting my mother, but I thought she would never tell her subsequent children. She was really buttoned up about it, really buttoned up. She didn't want anybody to know. And when I went to meet her, we had to meet in another town an hour away, and all that sort of thing. And she 5 years later, she told her 3 subsequent children through marriage, and they contacted me and we met. And then about 6 months before she died, we all had dinner together, which was a big deal. They were shocked they could get her to do it, like actually, have all of us together. And then after that, I met my father's family. He died a long time ago, but I met my sisters and brothers on my paternal side as well, and have ongoing communication with everybody on both sides. So now, enough about me. What are your questions?
Thank you for sharing that, Anne. I was wondering about your paternal side, and if that ever happened for you. That's great.
Yeah.
So I had some questions. If anybody has questions, please submit them in chat. And I had a birth mother comment to me. One thing that stuck in her mind were the stories about pain medication being withheld during labor and delivery. And sometimes until the girl signed her relinquishment papers, or stories of hospitals or homes for unwed mothers putting the girls in a room just to suffer alone in labor and delivery. And she was wondering if you would have more to say about that.
Well, there's no question that, I mean, this wasn't the case at every hospital or every maternity home, but there were some very negative attitudes about these girls, and there was punishment. And many of them said nurses would say things to them as they were in labor, and they're saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe the pain." And they'd say, "You should have thought about that. You should have kept your legs together." Things like it, just nasty things like that, you know. And I mean, you know, they were. There's no question that they were treated badly. And for that matter, you know, they were not informed of their rights. In most states, there was a period of when someone could revoke consent. And if probably every state had a period of when you could revoke consent, the consent you'd given for surrendering your child. Now, there were all kinds of tricks, like having the agency co-sign, so that even if you know, changed your mind, they would have to sign too. And there were all kinds of tricks, but I don't think any of the women actually knew there was any such thing as actually, I take that back. One woman talked about that. Everybody else did not even know at the time that there was the ability to revoke consent. And that would be after birth, when you realize this is your child and you see your child, and you might, you know, at that point feel totally differently than you did, you know, 24 hours earlier. And but most of them were not told that there was a period of time when they could revoke consent. And so, you know, one of the women says in the film, not knowing your options is the same as not having any options. You know, they were treated very, very badly all the way around, no question. And in some cases, they were told they were, at least one woman had long stories about being in a Catholic home, and she was told this was God's will, that she was chosen to have this baby for another family, and so on and so forth. You know, I mean, depending on who the message is coming from, it was couched in all kinds of different ways, but essentially, you're not good enough, you're not worthy, there are better people out there. If we use that standard for every baby that was born, we probably all have different parents, you know. But, you know, essentially, you know, it was a message of, you know, you're not worthy, you're bad, you're a bad girl, and being a bad girl makes you de facto a potentially very bad mother, and you're not worthy to raise your child. There are better people to do it than you.
And one thing that I remember from when we were showing the movie and having discussions after, every single time we did that, people in the room were really impacted by the tests on the infants. Yeah. I know it doesn't talk about that as much, but the movie does show some of that. Yeah. And that was really, people had a very strong reaction.
Yeah.
So if you want to say more about that. And then also we had a question, in 1960, was laudanum used on relinquished babies in order to keep them from crying?
I don't know the answer to that. Okay. But early on, there were, they were trying to match babies with families. And they, some of that kind of went awry, I would say. I was born in 49, adopted in 50. I was 3 months in, you know, the way station, even though I was slotted for adoption. They used to hold babies for 2 and 3 months at that time because there were certain childhood diseases that couldn't be diagnosed when you were really tiny. And so they wanted to wait and make sure you were a healthy baby before the adoptive family could take you home. And so when they had babies for that period of time, they did, in some cases, try to run, for all intents purposes, you know, intelligence tests and things like that on them, thinking that that they could not only match a child by looks, but also potentially by the intellectual level of the parents. And so that if you were, you know, a doctor and his wife, you would get a smart baby, you know, and I, you know, I don't know what to say. It's really appalling. It's like they're playing God, you know, picking and choosing. And but I don't know how much of that was done, but there was some done. And of course, there were all kinds of other experiments and things. I don't know if you've all seen the film about the triplets who were separated and at birth, which is a fabulous film.
3 identical strangers.
Yeah, because, and that was that was really an experiment to see what would happen if you raise 3 identical children in totally different, economic and circumstances and so forth. It was fairly, well, I would say it's still pretty unregulated myself, but it was kind of the Wild West in the right after World War II, when all of a sudden the numbers started going up by dramatic numbers, and there were lots of babies, and that's when all the push started going out there with these stories about all the unwanted babies. Because before that, people felt that if a child was the child of, this is kind of the nature nurture thing, but people worried about adopting somebody else's child, and worried that if that child was the child of a criminal or a prostitute, maybe they would grow up to be a criminal or a prostitute. And so it took some convincing in the very beginning to convince people that a child was a blank slate. And so they're like these opposing opinions, the child is a blank slate. You can take it home, and if you get it early enough, you can just make it anything you want it to be, kind of, you can shape it, and there'll be nothing in there that is a reflection of the actual, parents. Now we know that it's a combination of nature and nurture, but at the time it took swinging all the way over to this idea of blank slate to get a lot of people to come forward and adopt. And then it just snowballed out of control. There were way more people wanting to adopt these unwanted babies than there were babies available. Despite the tens of thousands of babies available, there were still something like 10 families for every child that was available.
And another question from a birth mother. Any thoughts on some of the framing messages that adoption agencies use toward prospective birth mothers even today? For example, what an act of love and selflessness to relinquish this child. You are making this couple so happy.
Yeah.
I'm a birth mother, and hear almost identical phrasing from fellow birth mothers in various support groups that we all seem to have learned from an adoption agency.
Yeah. No, this idea that if you deny your child this wonderful opportunity to have better parents who have more to offer, more, what does that really mean? Usually that means more money, status, they're married, they're highly educated, whatever that is. But we understand socially what that is, what more is. It's all those things. And for a young woman who is worked on over time and told that her child could have so much more, could have a much richer life, a much better life, if she was willing to give it that opportunity, to me, that's, you know, it's coercion, plain and simple. And that kind of reason should never be used. If those mothers were aware of how a lot of adoptees feel, I think, you know, that something might change. There are plenty of adoptees who feel, you know, given away by their own mother, who feel low self-esteem, who feel have some of the same issues, attachment issues, all kinds of things, because they feel they've been, you know, their own mother didn't want them. You know, everybody suffers when you're not truthful, and you know, you know, the secrecy and lies have to be taken out of adoption for it to function properly. There are always going to be some women who, for one reason or another, even given completely informed consent, I mean, even if they give completely informed consent and are well aware of all the options available to them and who can support them if they keep their child, they may still choose to surrender their child, and they should have the right to do that. They're the mother. But to tell young women that what's best for their child is to give it to somebody else, I think is criminal. It's coercion.
Yes.
And it's the same message that the women heard then. I mean, they also added in, no man's going to ever want you, you know, I mean, they, you know, you're going to, you know, rot in hell, whatever. But this idea that, like I said earlier, if the standard of keeping a child or not keeping a child is that there might be people out there who could do a better job, then that standard should be applied to all babies born, right? I mean, why is it applied to women who are single? A lot of those women have total support from families, and it doesn't mean they're going to be single forever. You know, plus there are a lot of married women who surrender babies. You know, they can't afford to have another baby. They have 3 or 4 kids. They're trying to get on their feet. They're trying to go back to work. It's late. They have, you know, late in their childbearing years, they get pregnant, and they and the husband and wife together decide to surrender their child. It happens. So, you know, this idea that it's all these teenagers, you know, getting pregnant at 15 or something, that is not the typical scenario anymore. I don't know if it ever was, but it's not. And so, you know, there's always somebody better, wealthier, more educated, you know, I think it's outright coercion to use that as a matter of fact. At one point I did a talk at a Cub conference specifically about that, and showed videos from a couple of agencies where they had young women talking about this great decision that they made, and they all used exactly the same kind of language. It was, you know, it's if you pay, I mean, if you pay any attention to, you know, like media literacy issues and how these things get reflected back in the culture and in these microcultures, like in agencies and so forth, where a certain message is fed to the young women over and over and over, and then they repeat it back, and they all repeat it back in the same way. It's really clear where they're getting that message. They're not getting that message from their parents or the support system they might have. They're getting that message from an agency.
You know, another thing that I remember echoed in a number of the stories, those lines of coercion is your child will be called a bastard on the playground.
Yeah. That was what almost every woman I interviewed heard that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's another question. Wondering if Anne has any insight into birth mothers and birth fathers who are unwilling to have contact with the relinquished child. I feel I'm one of those few birth parents. I feel that she feels that she has one of those few birth parents who won't acknowledge them.
Yeah, I hear, well, I should say that since the book came out, I've probably gotten 10,000 emails from readers. And so I've heard a lot of story. Oh God, can you see me? I just got.
Oh, we can see you.
Okay, I've got to try to get back on this. I hit something and I couldn't see anybody. And so I hear that story. Adoptees contact me and say, you know, my mother's different than the women in the book and she doesn't want contact with me. And of course, the women that are afraid to have contact are the ones that also would not allow me to interview them for the book. So the primary reason that I have found, well, there's actually probably two primary reasons. One is that person has not been forthcoming with their family. And after however many years, whether it's 40, 50, 60, or 80, to all of a sudden announce to their family and the children they've told to be honest as they were growing up and so on and so forth, to all of a sudden say to that family, I have kept something from you all these years. They are afraid of losing the love of the family that's a sure thing that they have. To risk knowing someone that they don't know yet against losing what they do have now is very real and threatening, because they feel like their own family might reject them. After all, think of how they were treated when they first became pregnant. Now, this might be somebody of a different era, I don't know. It got better with time in terms of how people were treated, but I would say that fear of having to own up and tell people that don't know, like come out, you know, and have this get out into the community and out to the family and aunts and uncles and other people in your life, that you have this big, deep, dark secret, keeps a lot of women from coming out. The other thing, I mean, some women worry their husband will divorce them, that they'll be out, like if they don't have their own career, or, you know, or maybe they think it'll ruin their career, whatever. They risk losing, risk losing everything in trade for getting to know someone that they don't even know if they're going to be able to have a relationship with, a good relationship with. They don't know yet, right? So it's a risk. It's a big risk. And some women can't take it. They can't take that risk. The second reason I think that's common is that everything associated with that time is extremely painful. And in some cases, they've managed to keep it kind of buried. And they don't want all those feelings to come back. And they're worried they're gonna kind of lose it if all that comes back out again. I mean, they fear for their own emotional well-being. And they also fear their child might hate them. You know, how do they explain why they surrendered the child? I mean, all the fears you can imagine about how it could go, you know, in terms of a reunion. You're dealing with an unknown there. You're dealing with someone you don't know yet. They're your child, but they were raised in a different environment with different people. They could be, you know, somebody that you know, would take a long time to get to develop a relationship with, and it could be painful, and reunions can be very painful. There's a lot of ups and downs. People talk about the roller coaster ride of reunion. Some people just hit it off immediately and it all works. And some, you know, it's like a relationship, you know, how much does this person want? How much does that person want? How much contact, how much phone call, how much email, how much meeting and getting together and being brought into the family. It's so much to deal with. And usually people aren't on exactly the same page at the same time. It's sort of like, you know, a divorce, maybe it's more like divorce, where you have children together and, you know, you have to keep working this thing out. I don't know, but they're relationship issues and they're tough. And some people just feel they can't handle it emotionally.
Work out, and it can open doors to
it opens deep wounds, deep wounds, and deep trauma that was suffered before, issues with your own family, you know, that you maybe glossed over. You might be holding a lot of deep resentment about the way your family, you know, treated you. And now you have to, if the mom's mother and father are still living, now you have to bring this up again and say, my child contacted me and I want to welcome them into the family. And, you know, I mean, there are so many, the dynamics are so complicated. And some people just feel like at this point in my life, I don't know that I can handle all that, you know. And it's the real concerns. So a lot of people don't have any place to go. They don't know, you know, where to get help or have, you know, support or have questions answered about all that. So they're kind of hanging out there, not knowing what to do, you know. It can be, I mean, consider the fact that of the 100 women I interviewed, and again, randomly, I mean, I put the word out there, there were articles in newspapers with my email address, and people contacted me, and, you know, I met them through lectures I gave. I'd meet a young person, they'd say, but that happened to my aunt, or that happened to my mother. And, you know, I'd find somebody that way. I didn't pre-screen, you know, just pretty, about as random as you can get without one of these randomized samples that, you know, I don't know how you even get to that with moms, with birth moms. But out of the 100 women I interviewed, 30 of them never had another child. Now, that's at a time when, you know, childbearing is, you know, I mean, women are having kids, right? Lots of them. So, you know, that's how traumatic it was for them, that some women could not stand to hear a baby cry. Some women just felt the idea that they had been told so many times that they were unworthy in one way or another, that they just were convinced they weren't mother material, that they could not be a good mother. You know, I mean, it's a trauma. It's not, you know, it's not nothing, you know. And to open all that up again without knowing where you're going to get help or support, and, you know, risk being, you know, yelled at and by your family and your subsequent, you know, the kids you had after that, and your subsequent kids, and your husband who say, you lied to us, why didn't you ever tell us the truth? All those kinds of things. It's a lot, you know, to take on. And I know women who were really very strong, what I would consider feminist women in every other aspect of their life, but this one, you know, who just couldn't come out, you know. And, you know, it's powerful stuff.
Thank you. There are so many great questions, and we've run out of time, so I can't get to them all. I apologize to all of you that have questions. And we're reaching the end. Did you have any last words, Anne?
No, just thank you for attending this Zoom, and it was nice to see your faces, and you know, I hope that the adoptee who thinks their mother didn't care has changed her mind, and she should read my book so she understands the context of her birth.
I agree.
And I'm not trying to sell books. I just wanted her to understand, because it's important. Knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And also, since you mentioned, you know, where people can go for support, I just want to say we have many general support meetings, and we have a birth mother support group. I'm available on the helpline. Please reach out. There's lots of ways to get help and support. And we're at the end of our presentation. I want to thank everyone who joined us this evening, and thanks especially to Anne for your wisdom and for volunteering your time with us this evening. As many of you know, Adoption Network is a nonprofit organization serving individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. And to find out more about our organization and to support our work, please visit our website, adoptionnetwork.org. We're a membership organization. We hope you consider joining as a member. We're taking a break for the summer, and our next Monday evening speaker series will be returning September 13th. On June 30th, we're going to have a book group discussion of American Baby by Gabriel Glasser. And a reminder that we have 5 general discussion meetings a month, as well as monthly meetings for those with DNA discoveries. and a monthly birth mother support group. All of the information can be found on our website and in our calendar. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good
Bye, thank you.
And if you want to stick around for a little bit,
okay.